This is a story my dad has told me since I was a kid, and it's something I have never forgotten. Actually, I've heard it so many times that I feel like I can tell it just as accurately as he can. In 1977, and before I was born, my dad was out backpacking with 3 of his buddies in Colorado. They were in their early 20s at the time, all very outdoorsy guys, and they had planned a multi-day trip up in the mountains. On the first day, they hiked the longest part, which took up most of the daylight hours and was all uphill. They had gained a ton of altitude and eventually topped out on the first section and came to a wide alpine field that stretched out in every direction. It was getting close to sunset, and just before they started to think about setting up camp, they passed through a massive field full of bighorn sheep. He says at a minimum there were several dozen of them, but it could have been closer to 100 if they had been able to see farther down the hill. He says it was surreal how many there were because you don't normally see that many in one place, and they were all calmly grazing, not even paying attention to them hiking through the field. They actually took it as a good sign and kept going until they found a flat area just past the field where they figured they'd camp for the night. It was a high camp at just below 12,000 feet and right near Rawlins Pass. They were looking forward to a site like that though because they wanted a huge, wide open view of the stars. After they set up the tents, they got a fire going and sat around enjoying the quiet. They were passing drinks around and swapping backcountry stories like you do on those kind of trips, but it had mostly been spooky or weird things that had happened on other hikes. Right in the middle of their conversation, the entire sky above them lit up like it was daytime. It was so bright that my dad said he actually had to squint and throw his hand in front of his face to try and see what was going on. They all looked up and saw a huge fireball coming down through the sky. It wasn't ripping through the atmosphere like you'd think a meteorite would. It was falling, and it was falling slowly enough that they had time to react and jump up to their feet. As soon as they were standing, the fireball fell behind the next ridge closest to them, and it must have slammed into the ground because there was a massive boom that echoed through the canyon. My dad says it was so loud they felt a physical shock wave and heard the sound of small loose rocks moving and falling afterward. As you'd imagine, they all went crazy thinking they'd seen an actual meteorite hit the earth. It was scary and exciting and shocking all at the same time, and what made it even crazier was that they had just been telling strange wilderness stories, and then in the middle of talking about it, they had this totally unexpected and rare event happen. One of the guys, Whit, who was the kind of guy you'd call an adrenaline junkie today, immediately wanted to hike all the way over there and check it out with flashlights. He was the kind of guy that wouldn't think twice about doing something like that, even if it meant hiking across a sketchy ridgeline in the dark. But my dad and the other two proposed the safer alternative of hiking over to it in the daylight the next morning, and they convinced Whit to hold out for the night. There's no denying they were all buzzing about it though, and needless to say, none of them slept much that night. As soon as the sun popped up above the horizon, they were up and packing. They broke down camp fast and didn't even bother with breakfast, then hiked over the ridge and toward the direction where they thought the fireball had hit. It was just beyond Rawlins Pass, but still a decent hike with a lot of scrambling. Whit had been in the lead, of course, but he was a seasoned climber and mountaineer, so it made sense for him to find the best route over the ridge without a trail. When they finally made it to the top of the ridge, thinking it had to be just on the other side, Whit was the first one over. My dad watched him take the last steps to the top, then saw him stop dead in his tracks and just stand there staring. Then Whit turned around with this look on his face that my dad says he will never forget. It was pure shock, and not in a good way, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. My dad literally sprinted up the last 50-foot stretch to catch up with Whit, and when he crested the top and looked down, he understood immediately. There was a huge section of field just below them that was covered in bighorn sheep, but every one of them was dead. My dad and his friends dropped their packs on the ridge and ran down to get a better look, and there were dozens of bighorns scattered around everywhere. Some were intact, and some were nothing but limbs, bones, and other unidentifiable pieces. He says it looked like something had just ripped through the entire herd. They kept walking around expecting to find an impact crater or a giant burned area or some sign of the explosion they had all heard. If a meteorite had hit the ground and taken out a whole herd of large animals, there should have been some serious evidence of it, or at least an obvious patch of charred ground, but they didn't find a thing. He says they spread out and wandered around the field for over an hour, completely baffled. Witt had the only half-plausible idea that if it had been a meteorite, it could have possibly exploded in the air just above the ground, which might have affected the sheep but not the ground. While that made some sense, you would expect some kind of debris or disturbance on the ground, and there wasn't any. Not that they could find anyway. They ended up finishing the trip, but every minute of it was spent discussing what had happened. Every break, every meal, and every step of trail, they were talking about it, and none of them knew what to think. Even now, they still don't. My dad sees Witt at least a couple of times a year, and he's been like an uncle to me since I was born. I can't even tell you how many times I've heard them talking about this story. When I was young, it really used to scare me, but now I'm more curious than anything else. I so wish they would have reported it to someone so that at least a ranger might have gone up there to check it out. I also wish one of them had brought a camera so there were pictures. I guess I'm so close to the story that I feel like I want answers as much as my dad and his friends do. I've never been to Colorado, and I'm not even close to the hiker my dad was, but it is on my bucket list to someday hike to that same spot and see it for myself. I'm sure it looks completely normal after 40 years, but I'd still like to stand there and imagine what it must have been like. During my years in the Navy, I had a supervisor who I'll call Carl for this story that swore he'd had a true close encounter when he was younger. I knew and worked with this man for more than 2 years before I ever heard a thing about it though, and we did countless 12-hour shifts together in a comm center. I think because we had spent so much time together, I built a level of trust with him where he felt like he could tell me about it. If you want a mental picture of the guy, he was a tall, very fit African-American man in his mid-40s who was originally from Louisiana. He also worked harder than anyone I have ever known, and he was one of the greatest people that I've ever worked for. On one of our night shifts, a group of us had been talking about sightings and strange lights and things like that. There were believers and non-believers in the group. I was part of the latter and a skeptic, and we were just casually exchanging stories and having a fun debate about whether they were real or could be debunked and explained as something else. At some point, Carl walked by and overheard us and started shaking his head. Because I felt comfortable with him, I asked him bluntly if he believed in UFOs and aliens. He looked right at me and said, "If you haven't seen something with your own eyes, you probably won't believe, but I have, and they are real." He was dead serious when he said it too, and then just kept walking away. Everyone in the room thought he was joking, but he was looking directly at me when he said it, and I could tell he wasn't joking. He would occasionally make a sarcastic joke or a funny comment, but overall, he was a very professional and serious guy, and when he said that, he meant it. Later on that night, I had about an hour with him where it was just the two of us, and I had to bring up his earlier remark. So as a skeptic, I asked if he could tell me why he believed in those things, and surprisingly, he went straight into what happened to him. His story was that when he was a young man, and shortly before he had joined the Navy, he and his friends saw something at a public park back in Louisiana. They had just finished up a baseball game when the whole group saw some kind of dark reflective object almost appear out of nowhere, and it was hovering above the ground on the other side of the park. It hadn't come down from the sky or flown in from somewhere. He described it as just being there all of a sudden and said every one of them stood there with their jaws on the ground. It had been mostly dark with only the last bit of light in the sky, but they saw something black drop down out of the bottom of the main object. It wasn't a beam or anything like that. It was what he called a black blur that moved like it was alive and made this connection from the object to the ground in a very organic and fluid way. He said when he looked over at his friends, they were locked in place like statues, and he could palpably feel the fear in the air. Then, when he looked back at the object, and whatever the thing was that was connecting it to the ground, all of the air around it got hazy or fuzzy, similar to a mirage. He could still see the overall shape of the thing and still saw that it was connected to the ground, but he couldn't make out any detail. I should also mention that he was totally aware of how crazy this all sounded while he was telling the story, and said several times that he wouldn't even believe someone telling him the same story, but swore to me that he was simply giving me the facts of what happened, crazy or not. After watching this in the park for what he guessed was under 3 minutes, the part of it that had been touching the ground pulled back up into the main object, again in a very fluid way. Then, just as quickly as they had seen it show up, it went away. Nothing took off or flew up into the air, and they never saw a single flash or light. It just faded away like some kind of hologram. He also made it clear that if there hadn't been a group of other people around witnessing the same thing, he would have thought he was on LSD or something, because the entire event was like one weird hallucination. As soon as the object was gone, they erupted into a mixture of mild panic and talking over each other all at once. Some of his friends got in their cars and left the park immediately, while a few others wanted answers and suggested walking over to the other side of the park to check it out. That was where he ended his story though, and he never told me anything more about the friends he was with or if any of them had actually walked over to where it was. The only part he added was that being in the Navy for so long had solidified his belief in it, whatever that meant. To put it mildly, I was in shock at hearing a story like that come out of his mouth. And as someone who has never believed in the paranormal, he would have been the very last person in the world I'd expect it from. It was just so weird. Here was a guy that all of us would trust with our lives, and probably the most honest dude I've ever met, telling me he had seen something unexplainable. All I can say is I did then, and still do now, have the utmost respect for him and trust for him. If I could put every human being I've ever met in a line, and I had to choose which one I would believe the most with a story like that, it would be Carl, no question. He would never in a million years make up a fake story, especially one so off the wall. I don't know what he and his friends saw in that park, and it doesn't even sound like any of the other UFO or sighting stories I've heard, but I fully believe he did see it, whatever it was. My name is Matt. My family and I live on the west side of Pueblo, Colorado, and our neighborhood is literally on the edge of town. If anyone is curious exactly where this happened, our house is on Tierra Casa Drive. If you look at our road on a map, you can see that the backs of all of our houses are against a huge amount of open field and empty land. Back in October of 2021, our daughter was in first grade. A few weeks into the school year, she brought home a horrible stomach flu from school and had been throwing up all night. I was the lucky one who was up with her every hour, helping her in the bathroom and putting her back to bed. It was around 1:30 in the morning when I finally got her back to sleep for the 4th time. After putting her to bed, I was carrying a trash bag full of puke and paper towels down the stairs to take it out to the outside bin. When I was halfway down the stairs, I happened to look out the window on our landing that has a view of the open field, and I saw this light falling toward the ground. It looked like one of those floating lanterns, but with a cooler blue light coming off of it, and it was very slowly falling straight down from the sky. I went out our side door in the garage and threw the bag away. Then I walked around the side of the house and toward the back, and by the time I got to the corner, I could see it perfectly. The light was already lower than it had been, and now it was just above the field behind us. It couldn't have been more than a few hundred feet away from our neighborhood. As I was watching it get closer to the ground, it was really hard to tell how big it was. It wasn't casting any light down onto the field, and the color of the light was weird. It was sort of a pale blue-white, but not bright. It wasn't flickering either. It was just a steady light that kept coming down until I saw it actually hit the field. Except it didn't stop when it hit the ground. Call it a lack of sleep or my eyes, but it looked to me like the light kept going down and into the actual ground. Like I watched it come down into the grass and even light up the grass around it for a second. Then it sank into the ground and I could see the light fade out. It's hard to explain, but it was just a very weird thing to see. Right when the light went out, I felt a deep vibration. Not a huge one, but it reminded me of really low bass that you'd hear next to a subwoofer, where you kind of hear it and feel it at the same time. That only lasted a few seconds, and then it was just dead quiet again. I stood there at the corner of the house for a second, not really knowing what was happening. Then I heard my daughter calling for me again since I had left the door wide open, so I went back inside and mostly forgot about it because I had other things to deal with. On top of all of that, the next morning, I woke up sick with the same stomach bug. I spent the entire morning throwing up and it was brutal. I didn't even think about the light again until the day after that. I was sitting on the couch eating and finally feeling halfway normal again when I remembered seeing it. It kind of came rushing back to me and I wanted to know what it was, so I figured I'd walk out there and take a look. Some of our neighbors have a fenced backyard, but we don't, so I can just walk straight out into the field from our house. I headed out there and tried to find the spot where I thought the light went down, but I didn't see anything. I really didn't spend that much time looking, maybe about 10 minutes. Then I just gave up and went back in and decided it didn't really matter that much. I completely forgot about it after that until a few days later while I was in my garage. I was laying on my side on the concrete moving a storage bin under my workbench, and out of nowhere, I felt that same exact bass vibration. I don't mean it was similar to it, it was exactly the same one, and it felt like it was directly below my garage. This time though, I could feel it in pulses. The pulses were not only perfectly timed, which made me think it couldn't be something natural, but it honestly felt like whatever was causing it was moving, because at first it felt like it was in front of me, then I could feel it more at my back. It only lasted about 2 minutes, but while it was happening, I could undeniably feel it in my arm and chest and through my hand when I would put my palm on the floor. Then 4 or 5 days after that, it happened again while I was replacing a sprinkler head in our backyard and right at the border of our property and the field. I was kneeling down on our lawn and felt the identical vibration again. That time it came through my knees, and it was even stronger than when I was in the garage. Again, it was doing the same perfectly timed pulsing, and it was without a doubt coming from underground. The first thing I thought to do was lay down flat on the grass and put my ear to the ground. When I did that, I could hear it even more clearly. It really sounded like some kind of heavy equipment was working close by or something, but we didn't have any construction going on anywhere. For a second time, this only lasted a few minutes, but it was so confusing because I could not figure out what was causing it. This was such an obvious vibration that it had to be coming from underground, and it didn't even feel like it was that deep. The time in the backyard was the last time I felt it though, and I haven't noticed any other vibrations or sounds at all since then, so whatever it was must be gone. I know Colorado can get seismic activity, and we have had earthquakes here, but I cannot convince myself that what I felt and heard was natural. Whatever I was feeling was like a metronome, and it was just too perfectly timed. And the fact that it sounded like it was almost moving around underground when I was in the garage was just too weird. I also think it's more than a coincidence that the first time it happened was right after seeing that light fall out of the sky into the field. I don't know what was going on out there during that 2-week period, but it was something, and I don't think it had anything to do with nature. I still find myself putting both of my hands on the ground if I'm outside doing something, just to see if I might feel anything again.